They laughed at her. Every single one of them. An entire alien civilization, beings who had lived for thousands of years, who had crossed galaxies, who had built weapons that could crack moons in half. They all looked at one human girl and laughed. She was standing in the middle of their greatest hall, the most sacred place in the known universe, a place where no human had ever been allowed to enter. And she was holding something none of them expected. Something they said was impossible. Something they said no human could ever create. But here is the part that will genuinely shock you. She had already made it, long before they ever told her she couldn't. Tonight, you are going to hear the full story. The story of a girl named Mara Ellis, a human engineer from a small town in rural England. A woman who grew up with grease on her hands, a head full of ideas, and a fire inside her that nothing in this universe could put out. You are going to learn how she walked into the most powerful room in the galaxy, alone, and walked out having changed everything. Let me show you exactly how this happened. Mara Ellis was not supposed to be anyone important. That is the truth. That is exactly how her story starts. Not with glory, not with a prophecy, not with some ancient power awakening inside her. She was just a girl, a human girl from a tiny village in Shropshire, England, where the biggest excitement of the week was the Saturday market and the occasional sheep escaping onto the main road. Her mother was a seamstress. Her father repaired old machines for a living. Broken tractors, old generators, rusted engines that nobody else wanted to touch. He had a small workshop behind their house, and from the time Mara could walk, she was in that workshop with him, watching, learning, asking questions that made her father laugh because they were too smart for a 5-year-old. By the time she was 8, she was fixing things herself. By 12, she was building things from nothing. Not toys, real things, functional things. A water pump for their neighbor's garden. A small wind turbine she constructed from spare parts and scrap metal she found at the local dump. Her teachers did not know what to do with her. She was too advanced for the normal lessons. Too curious. Too restless. She would finish an exam in 10 minutes and spend the rest of the class sketching machines in the margins of her notebook. Everyone in her village liked her, but nobody really understood her. She got a scholarship to a university in London when she was 17, studied aerospace engineering, then materials science, then quantum metallurgy, which is a field so specialized that only about 200 people in the entire world truly understood it at the time. By 26, she was working for a private research firm that had a government contract nobody was allowed to talk about. She lived alone in a small flat in Bristol. She worked 18-hour days. She had few friends and no social life to speak of. But she had her lab. And in her lab, she was the happiest person on Earth. Then the Valdre arrived. Nobody was ready for it. There is no way to be ready for the moment. An alien fleet appears in low Earth orbit on a Tuesday morning. The kind of ships they had were beyond anything human engineers had imagined. They were not metal in any way humans understood. They moved through space in ways that broke the accepted rules of physics. They were enormous and ancient and utterly silent. The Valdre were humanoid, but not human. Taller, pale-skinned, eyes that were solid gold from edge to edge. They moved with a kind of slow, deliberate grace that made every human in the room feel clumsy by comparison. They communicated through a combination of sound and what scientists later described as directed low-frequency vibration. When a Valdre spoke to you directly, you felt the words in your chest before you heard them in your ears. They made contact with world governments within 48 hours of arrival. Their message was calm, clinical, almost bored. They had been monitoring Earth for several centuries. They had decided that humanity was now developed enough to be formally introduced into what they called the collective, a vast network of civilizations spanning multiple galaxies. There were conditions. Of course, the Valdre had a process for every new civilization they encountered. A series of assessments, tests of intelligence, of ethics, of creativity, of resilience. Humanity passed most of them faster than the Valdre expected. The scientific community was quietly proud. World leaders tried not to appear too eager. But then came the final test. The Valdre called it the Forge Trial. It had existed for over 4,000 years. Every civilization that wanted full membership in the collective had to complete it. The rules were simple. A representative of the applying civilization would be given access to a sample of Valdre core material, a substance called vithril, and would have 30 days to forge it into a functional piece of armor using only the tools and knowledge of their own civilization. Nobody had ever failed the Forge Trial, but nobody fully human had ever attempted it either. Vithril was not like anything found on Earth. Scientists who examined the sample described it as simultaneously existing in 3 different physical states at once. It was harder than any known material. It was also somehow alive, in a way no instrument could properly measure. It responded to intent, to emotion, to the mental state of whoever was working with it. Every expert humanity had metallurgists, physicists, engineers, materials scientists, was given 48 hours to examine the sample. Every single one of them said the same thing. It was impossible to forge. And then someone mentioned a name. Mara Ellis. The call came at 2 in the morning. Mara was still in her lab, which surprised nobody who knew her. She was running a stress test on a new titanium alloy composite she had been developing for 6 months. Coffee going cold on her desk. Music playing low through a small speaker on the shelf. Completely in her own world. When her phone rang and she saw it was a number she did not recognize, a government prefix she had never seen before, she almost ignored it. She picked up on the 4th ring. The voice on the other end was calm and official. A man who introduced himself only as Director Harlow. He did not waste time on pleasantries. He told her that she had been recommended by 3 separate research teams as the single most qualified materials engineer currently alive. He told her that her classified work on reactive quantum composites had come to the attention of people very high up in a situation she was not yet cleared to know about. He told her the world needed her. She thought it was a prank. She actually said that out loud. She said, quite plainly, that this was either a prank or the strangest recruitment call she had ever received, and in either case she was going back to her stress test. Director Harlow sent her a photograph. It was a sample of vithril, even through a photograph on a phone screen. At 2 in the morning under fluorescent lab lights, Mara felt something happen in her brain. A kind of recognition she could not explain. Like seeing a color that does not have a name, but knowing instantly that it is your favorite. She was in London by 5 a.m. They showed her everything. The Valdre fleet in orbit. The footage of first contact. The terms of the collective agreement. The results of every expert assessment of the vithril sample. She read through 47 pages of technical analysis in less than 2 hours, barely blinking. Then they took her to see the vithril itself. It was kept in a sealed chamber in a government facility outside the city. The room was climate-controlled and heavily guarded. 2 Valdre observers stood in the corner, watching everything with those flat gold eyes. The sample sat on a reinforced table in the center of the room, sealed under a transparent barrier. It was about the size of a dinner plate. Dark and silver, not quite solid, not quite liquid. It shifted when nobody was touching it, as if it was breathing. Mara put on the provided protective gloves and reached out toward the barrier. One of the Valdre observers made a sound. Not quite a word. More like a warning tone, low and resonant. The interpreter standing nearby leaned in, and whispered that the observer wanted the human to know that contact required explicit clearance. Mara looked at Director Harlow. He gave a single nod. She pressed her gloved hand flat against the barrier. The Vithril moved. Immediately, it slid across the table's surface toward her hand like water running downhill. Both Valdre observers straightened. The interpreter went very quiet. One of the military personnel in the room actually took a step back. Director Harlow said, very quietly, "That has not happened before." Mara was not listening. She was staring at the material. Her eyes were moving the way they did when she was solving a problem. Fast and focused and utterly present. She stepped back from the barrier, pulled off the gloves, turned to Director Harlow and said, quite simply, "I need my own tools. I need my full lab equipment shipped here within 24 hours. I need complete access to every technical file your scientists have produced. And I need everyone to leave me alone." There was a pause in the room. One of the Valdre observers spoke. The interpreter listened, then looked at Mara with an expression that was somewhere between amused and uncertain. The observer says, the interpreter said slowly, that no being of any species has ever forged Vithril on the first attempt. Most never forge it at all. Mara picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. "Tell them I've been doing impossible things since I was 8 years old," she said. "Tell them I'll be ready in 30 days. She was ready in 22. The first week was the hardest. Mara did not sleep more than 3 hours a night. She barely ate. She existed entirely inside the problem, which is what she had always done when something truly captured her attention. The outside world stopped existing. There was only the material, only the work. The Vithril responded to her in ways she could not immediately explain. When she was calm and focused, it became more pliable. When she was frustrated or tired, it stiffened and pulled away from her instruments. It was the most responsive material she had ever encountered. Not intelligent, exactly, but deeply reactive, deeply aware. She began keeping a journal. Not notes, an actual written journal. Personal observations about her mental state and how the material behaved in response. She noticed that it responded best when she was in what she described as a flow state. That deep, quiet zone of total concentration that every craftsman and artist and engineer knows, but nobody can fully explain. She started meditating before each session. She, Mara Ellis, who had never meditated a day in her life, sat cross-legged on the floor of a government lab for 20 minutes every morning before she touched the Vithril. The Valdre observers watched all of this through the exterior cameras. They said nothing publicly, but the interpreter told Director Harlow, privately, that the observers had changed their internal assessment of the human 3 times in the first week alone. That was reportedly unprecedented. By day 10, Mara had forged the first stable connection between Vithril and a terrestrial titanium substrate. It held for 6 hours before the bond degraded. Every previous attempt by other engineers had failed within minutes. She wrote in her journal that night, "It wants to connect. It just needs to trust the hands." By day 15, she had developed what she called a resonance mapping technique, a way of reading the Vithril's reactive patterns the same way a blacksmith reads the color of heated steel. Intuitive, sensory, built from observation and repetition, and a kind of deep listening that could not be taught in a textbook. The armor began taking shape on day 17. Not from a template, not from the Valdre designs she had been shown. From her own mind, her own vision of what armor should be, what it should do, what it should feel like to wear. She worked with the Vithril the way her father had worked with broken engines, not forcing it, but having conversation with it, finding what it wanted to become. The Valdre observers had been silent for most of the process. But on day 17, when the first complete chest plate emerged from her forge, solid, seamless, the circuit patterns of the vithril now integrated into a structure that was both human in its design and alien in its material. One of the observers entered the room for the first time. It stood at the edge of her workspace, looked at the chest plate for a long time. Then it looked at Mara. The interpreter was not in the room. There was nobody to translate. But Mara felt the words in her chest before she heard them. Low and resonant and unmistakable. How? She looked at the observer, then at the armor, then back. The same way we do everything, she said. We learned, we adapt, and we do not stop. The observer stood there for another full minute. Then it left the room without another sound. Director Harlow watched the exchange on the security feed from outside. He told his assistant afterward that he was not entirely sure what had just happened, but that it felt, for the first time since the Valdre arrived, like something had genuinely shifted. On day 22, Mara set down her tools. The armor was complete. Full body, perfectly fitted to human proportions, made of vithril and terrestrial alloys woven together in a pattern that should not have been physically possible according to every known law of materials science. She sent a single message to Director Harlow. It said, "Tell them it's done." The forged trial presentation took place in the Valdre command vessel. No human had been inside one before. That fact alone made the entire event extraordinary. Mara was transported up in a Valdre shuttle, a small, silent craft that moved through the atmosphere like water through water, accompanied only by Director Harlow and the two observers who had watched her work. The command vessel was vast in a way that was difficult to process. The ceilings were 20 meters high. The corridors were lit by a diffuse golden light that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Everything was built to a scale that reminded humans how new they were to all of this. They were brought to the Hall of Judgment. It was the most significant room on the ship, the place where every forged trial presentation in 4,000 years of Valdre history had taken place. The walls were lined with what appeared to be records, physical impressions in the vithril wall material, each one representing civilization that had passed the trial before. There were many, and there were a few dark spaces, places where the record simply stopped, civilizations that had attempted the trial and failed, their names no longer spoken. Mara carried the armor herself, in a long sealed case. She walked into the Hall of Judgment with it under her arm and a completely steady expression on her face, and Director Harlow later said it was the most composed thing he had ever seen a human being do. The chamber was full of Valdre, senior figures, based on the elaborate markings on their garments. They stood in a wide semicircle facing the presentation point. Their gold eyes were fixed on Mara before she even reached the center of the room. And then it started. One of them, the tallest, with silver markings across the upper half of her face, spoke at length. The interpreter, who had joined them inside, translated in a low voice. The speaker was explaining the history of the forged trial, the significance of vithril, the criteria for judgment, the fact that no human had ever stood in this room before. And then, with what could only be described as deliberate emphasis, the speaker said that in 4,000 years of conducting the forged trial, no civilization had ever succeeded without multiple attempts. Most required years. Some required generations. The implication was clear. This was a formality, a respectful gesture toward a young species that had impressed them in other ways. A chance for humanity to try, to fail gracefully, and to come back and try again someday, wiser and more prepared. Mara listened to all of it with her case resting in her hands. When the interpreter finished, there was a long pause, an expectant silence, the kind that forms before a verdict is read. Mara set the case on the presentation surface. She unlatched the clasps, slowly, Without rushing, with the same quiet deliberateness she brought to every moment in the lab. She lifted the lid. The reaction in the room was immediate and total. Silence, complete and absolute. Not the silence of a pause, the silence of an entire chamber of ancient, experienced beings all having the same thought at the exact same moment, and not one of them having a word for it yet. The armor lay in the case fully assembled, gleaming, the vitral circuits alive with soft amber light, pulsing gently, perfectly integrated into the terrestrial alloy structure. It was not a copy of Valdre design. It was something new, something that had never existed before. A fusion of two civilizations expressed in a single object. The tall Valdre with the silver markings stepped forward. She looked at the armor for a long time. Then she looked at Mara, then back at the armor. She reached out one long pale hand and touched the chest plate. The vitral lit up, bright and full, the way it had lit up for Mara on the very first day. The tall Valdre withdrew her hand slowly. She turned to the assembled chamber. She said one word. The interpreter did not translate it immediately. He stood very still for a moment, and when Director Harlow quietly asked what it meant, the interpreter looked at him with an expression that was almost stunned. It means, the interpreter said, worthy. Nobody laughed after that. The chamber was still. Every Valdre figure standing in that semicircle had gone very quiet in a way that felt less like silence and more like recalibration. Like beings who had held a belief for a very long time and were now watching it slowly change shape in front of them. Mara stood at the presentation surface with her hands at her sides. She was not performing confidence. She was not trying to look impressive. She was simply standing the way she always stood. Steady, present, completely herself. Director Harlow, watching from behind, said later that it was the longest minute of his life. Then the tall Valdre with the silver markings spoke again. At length, the interpreter listened without interrupting, and when she finally finished, he turned to Mara and took a breath. He told her this. The speaker had said that in 4,000 years of conducting the Forge trial, they had seen many things. Civilizations of extraordinary intelligence, civilizations of extraordinary strength, civilizations with technologies that made human science look like early cave drawings. But they had never seen a being forge vitral in 22 days. The material itself had never responded to anyone the way it had responded to Mara. In the entire recorded history of the collective, vitral had never integrated with a non-Valdre alloy. It had always remained pure, separate, resistant to every outside material it had ever encountered. Until now, the speaker said they did not fully understand what Mara had done. Not technically, not scientifically. They had recordings of every session in the lab. Their greatest materials scientists had already begun reviewing the footage, and they could not explain it. Which, the speaker said with something that the interpreter described as the Valdre equivalent of humility, had not happened in a very long time. Humanity was formally accepted into the collective. Not as a provisional member, not as a junior civilization under observation. As a full member, with all rights and access that came with that status. The process that normally took decades of assessment and probationary periods was completed that afternoon in the Hall of Judgment. Because of one human woman and a piece of armor that should not have existed. But here is the part of this story that almost never got told. The detail that Director Harlow kept classified for 3 years before it finally became known. The piece of the story that changes everything you thought you understood about how it happened. When the debriefing team reviewed Mara's lab journals after the presentation, they found entries from week 1 that described, in precise technical detail, the exact forging technique she ultimately used. The resonance mapping, the substrate integration method, the specific frequency sequencing that allowed the Vithril to accept the terrestrial alloy. All of it was there, written down, from the very first days. She had not discovered the technique through trial and error over 22 days. She had arrived at the core of it within 72 hours of first contact with the material. She had spent the remaining 19 days refining it, perfecting it, making sure that when she walked into that hall, the armor she carried was not just functional. It was extraordinary. Director Harlow asked her about it privately. He asked her when she had actually known it was possible. She thought about it for a moment. Then she said, "When I saw the photograph, at 2 in the morning, before I even touched it." He asked how that was possible. She smiled, the same smile, apparently, that her father had taught her, the one that meant the answer was simpler than people wanted it to be. "Because I grew up being told what I couldn't do," she said, "and I stopped listening a long time ago. They said no human could forge it." She already had. Not on day 22. Not on day 10. Not even on the first day in the lab. She had forged it the moment they told her it was impossible. That is when the real work always begins. Here is what nobody talks about. The Valdre, after everything, after 4,000 years of conducting the forge trial, quietly changed the official record. They did not reduce the standard. They did not simplify the test. They added a note to the permanent record in the Hall of Judgment, next to the impression left by Mara's armor in the Vithril wall. It reportedly reads, in their language, "First forge, no prior attempt." There has never been another entry like it in their history. And Mara Ellis, the girl from a village in Shropshire who fixed water pumps at age 12 and spent her 20s in a lab most people had never heard of, went on to become the first human representative to the Collective Science Council. She still keeps a journal. If this opened your eyes to what one person is truly capable of, you are not going to want to miss what comes next. Let's bring it back to what really matters here. Mara Ellis was not chosen because she was the most famous. She was not chosen because she had the most powerful connections, or the biggest platform, or the loudest voice. She was chosen because she had spent her entire life solving problems that other people had already given up on. The armor existed in her mind before it existed in the material. That is the truth of this story, and that truth applies to every single person watching this right now. Now here is your question for the comments. I want to know, when was the last time someone told you something was impossible, and you did it anyway? Drop it below. I read every single comment. If this story hit different for you, hit that subscribe button right now. Because the next story on this channel is going to take everything you felt watching this and multiply it. A human crew. An alien war that should have been lost in the first hour. And the decision one person made that changed the outcome of an entire galaxy. You do not want to miss that one. See you there.